Good evening, thanks to the Torah Centre for bringing me out from England. Please don't send me back. Tonight, what's today? What am I talking about? What's the topic today? Yes, who controls our destiny, God or us? Purim through philosophical eyes. So what I wanted to do is look at a specific philosophical issue that's raised by the story of Purim. But I'm going to start by exploring a philosophical issue that's related to the philosophical issue I actually want to discuss. And sometimes that's the way to really understand one problem, is to understand another problem in the neighbourhood. So the problem I'm going to discuss with you, first off, in order to motivate the real topic, is the problem known as theological fatalism, or in less highfalutin language, the problem of free will and God's foreknowledge. Okay, so put non-technically, the idea is if God knows what you're going to do tomorrow, then you can't be free to change what you're going to do tomorrow because God already knows it. But with the pedantry associated with academic philosophy, let's write it out step by step, the problem, and try and understand it. Okay. So the first premise in the problem is God always knows everything. Okay, that's the first premise, from which it's supposed to follow that yesterday God knew that you would do X, you would do X on Monday, i.e. tomorrow, right? Of course, if God always knows everything, then even yesterday God knew that you would do X on Monday, if of course you're going to do X on Monday. Okay? This one is probably... So the first two premises look pretty unoffensive. They look pretty well motivated. If you're a religious kind of a person, you're probably going to think that number 1 and 2 are true. The third premise looks like it's the most shaky, but let's go with it, let's run with it for the sake of argument. It's you can't change the past. Now, the reason that's shaky is if anyone's seen Back to the Future, the trilogy, right? Well, maybe you can change the past. Like, I can't change the past. But, you know, if I had a time machine, maybe I could change the past. And there are some ways that you could defend 3 anyway. Actually, if you have a time machine, you're not changing the past. Mm-hmm. You're changing the present, but you just go to... Like, that's to say, if I go in a time machine, right, there's no moment at which I'm in the past. It's just my present, right? I get in the car. Well, it's the DeLorean, right? I get in the car and I go back to 1983. What was present for me was 2015 before I got in the car. Afterwards, when I got out of the car, what was present for me was whatever, 1983, whatever he goes back to, I can't remember. But it goes back to the Wild West, doesn't he, one of them? But for Marty McFly, there's never a point at which he's changing the past. He moves his present back into the past, right? That's one way to defend it. Another way to defend it is there's no such thing as time travel. Right? It might actually be that time travel is just not possible. So, for one reason or another, 3 might be a bit shaky, but not all that shaky. We have this expression in English, right? Do you have this in American too? Because I know you don't speak exactly the same language. We have this expression. It's no use crying over spilt milk. Why? Why is that? What's done is done. Because it's spilt. You can't unspill it, right? Spilt milk is spilt, and you can't unspill it, and that's number 3. Well, if you think numbers 1, 2, and 3 are true, then 4's going to fall out. You can't change what God knew yesterday, right? Because yesterday's the past. Right, well that means if you can't change what God knew yesterday, and God knew yesterday that you were going to do X on Monday, and you can't change the fact that God knew yesterday, so you can't not do X. Do you see it? Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Right? If everything we've written up so far is true, then we're really in trouble, right? What it turns out, I don't want to bore you all by writing out every single step, but what it turns out is that God's knowing what you're going to do on Monday, yesterday, is not something you can change. So what you do on Monday isn't going to change what he knew 2 days ago from Monday, right? So it turns out you're going to basically just act in accordance with the script that God already knew. There's no free will. That's the problem. Not actually our problem, but a related problem. So if I don't solve this problem for you this evening, tough. Okay? But you know the problem, okay? So a similar problem comes up in this week's parasha, in this week's Megillah, in the story of Purim. So bracket what we've said so far. One of the noteworthy things about the story of Purim, if you read the Megillah, is God doesn't make a kind of frontal appearance. If he's in the story, he's working behind the scenes, right? He never says anything about God in the book of Esther, right? Which actually makes it read as a piece of literature. It doesn't read as a biblical piece of literature. It looks like a kind of ancient Near Eastern political intrigue drama, like a really old version of The West Wing or something, rather than a book of biblical literature. There's no talk about God. There's just talk about the monarchy, about this kind of marital issues between King Ahasuerus and his wife Esther. I don't think is everybody familiar with the story of Purim. I don't want to kind of presume, right? So the basic idea is there's this king, this Persian king whose wife finds disfavour with him, Vashti, and for one reason or another, she gets pushed off the kind of scene violently, and the king takes a new wife, Esther. Esther is a Jewish girl who hides her Jewish identity from the king, and as things unfold, a nasty guy called Haman wants to enact something like a genocide against all of the Jews in the empire, which is pretty much all of the Jews in the world. And luckily, fortuitously, because unbeknown to all of them, there is actually a Jewish queen in the palace, the plans are all thwarted, and more than thwarted, they're reversed. All the things that Haman had planned to do to the Jews got done to him. Okay, so that's the story, and like I said, God doesn't appear. It's not one of these stories where God emerges at the last minute to split a Red Sea for everybody. It looks like it's just lucky, right? And that's very much what the story's playing on. In fact, the reason it's called Purim, right, is a play on the way that Haman chose the date for the Jewish people's annihilation. He cast lots. So the name Purim means lots. It's named after the lots that Haman cast. It's all just luck, right? You draw lots is completely up to chance, up to fate. And as fate would have it, Esther happened to be a Jewish queen. Haman's plans are going to be thwarted. And you could be forgiven, therefore, for thinking that this is a secular piece of literature. But on the contrary, the idea is, you know the expression, of course, too good to be true, right? When everything just fits completely into place, those are the moments when one feels the hand of divinity, one feels the hand of God at work. Sometimes you have those kind of aha moments. Oh, now I get what, why on earth did I come to South Bend for a year? Oh, it was to meet the Lindows. Oh, I get it. you have a wonderful Shabbos meal at their house after a horrible, horrible winter, and you're just thinking, why did God schlep me here? I was in Israel, actually. Didn't come from England, I came directly from Israel. Why did God schlep me here? Now I get it. It was to meet the Lindaus. And when everything's just too good to be true, everything slots together, and you get that aha moment. That's God in the book of Esther. And in fact, if you look at the Midrashic tradition, the stories and the legends and the folklore that the rabbis spin around the story of Esther, there are a few things they really try to accentuate or exaggerate in the Midrashim, in these legends. So one thing they try to accentuate is how, even though the things don't seem miraculous, they really are miraculous. So for instance, of all of the women in the entire kingdom, Ahasuerus chooses Esther for his wife. Why? Well, the rabbis say that she was hideously ugly. Right? There is an Agadatah in Masechet Megillah, in Tractate Megillah, that says she was one of the 7 most beautiful women who ever lived. But there's another tradition that says, no, on the contrary, she was hideously ugly. To look at her, really nebuch, right? In fact, they say, why was she called Hadassah? Right? Her real name was Hadassah. My daughter's too young to understand this lecture, I'm pleased to tell you, because her name's Hadassah. But one of the reasons, says this Midrashic tradition, why she was called Hadassah, was because Hadassah means myrtle. So she was called Myrtle. Why was she called Myrtle? Well, the myrtle leaf is green. Right? A myrtle is a leaf, and it's green. Hadassah's skin, unfortunately, due to some horrible dermatological condition, was green. She was hideous to look at. So it was a complete miracle, right, that Ahasuerus should want to choose Esther. Now, the historicity of that story, is that really true? Is that what are the rabbis talking about? That's not the issue. What the rabbis are trying to draw your attention to is that everything had to be just so, against all the odds, for this story to work out the way that it did. And whether or not Esther was really ugly, there's a sense in which it's a miracle that she should be the one. Punkt, that Jewish girl should be the one of all of the women in the entire empire that Ahasuerus should choose. So one strand that the Midrash emphasizes is the miraculousness. That really what looks like chance is actually miracle. There's no way on earth, had things just played out according to the laws of nature, that Ahasuerus would have chosen this ugly excuse for a human specimen. Unfortunately, not a very nice way to speak about Esther and Malka, but I wouldn't have said it had the Midrash not put it that way. Another thing that the rabbis try to accentuate when they tell stories about Purim is they actually try to make everything seem, well, this is very similar to the last thing I said. So the first thing I said was they try to accentuate the miraculousness. They also try to make everything seem that much less likely. Right? The chances of this playing out properly were, in the Megillah, in the actual book, it looks like it's a pretty tall story, but after you've read what the rabbis have to say, the kind of statistical odds that the story had to kind of duck through is the ante is raised by the rabbis. And finally, something they accentuate is the degree to which, so the Megillah itself says that Haman's plans and the plans of the enemies of the Jews, as I said earlier, weren't just thwarted but were completely reversed. Such that anything that the enemies planned to do to us got done to them. Well, the rabbis really accentuate that to the smallest detail. So you see how, like the beginning of the story, all these people are drinking wine at this big festival. Well, at the end, it's the Jews drinking wine in a big festival, right? Purim's the festival where we're all allowed to get very drunk, unless you're under the age of 21, because America's very conservative about these things. Which is why you don't want to be in Israel, where all these 18-year-old Americans who've never touched alcohol before. It's just horrendous. Okay, so this is, on the surface of things, a book of chance. Things could have gone any other way. And if anything, the Midrashic tradition, the rabbinic tradition, accentuates that feature of the story and says, you think this was unlikely, let me tell it to you how it really was. It was really unlikely. And that's the miracle. But the thing is, there's a verse in the book of Esther, and here comes our philosophical problem. There's a verse in the book of Esther that threatens to kind of upslug the whole thing, right? And the verse is this. It's chapter 4, verse 14. Mordechai says to Esther, or he relays to Esther through a messenger, Ki im hacheresh techarishi be'et hazot. If you continue to be silent at this moment, if you continue to be inactive, Revach v'hatzala ya'amod la'Yehudim mimakom acher. Salvation's going to come for the Jews. That's for sure. Salvation's going to come. Va'at ubeit avich, but you and your father's house, and me, because Mordechai is part of her father's house, is an uncle or something. Ta'avedi. We might all be lost, right? You might get killed, I might get killed, our house might get killed, but salvation's going to come, whether it's by your hand or by someone else's hand, whether you're going to be the direct recipient of it or not. You might end up killed, but the Jewish people are going to be okay. Umi odea, and who knows? Im la'et kazot higat l'malchut. Who knows if maybe it's a moment like this was the reason that you became a queen? Who knows? What this verse makes it look like is it really didn't have to happen this way, right? So everything I'd laid down so far about the story of Purim makes it look like the nature of this miracle is that everything had to happen thus and so. If things hadn't fallen together just as they did, it would have been a catastrophe. And that's the story that the rabbis spin about Purim. But Mordechai says the opposite. It doesn't matter one jot whether you, Esther, are our saviour, whether things turn out, whether you have to play a role in this story. This story could be spun any other way. There's always going to be one ending. The ending is going to be the salvation of the Jews. Horrible things might happen to you in some of these stories. Did Americans have a collection of children's books called Choose Your Own Adventure? Yeah, I love those books. Okay, so it's a series of children's books where you're going through the story and then it says at the end, do you think that Bob should fly the magic carpet to Aladdin's cave? Or do you think he should go and have a cigarette? And so, if A, turn to page 57 and he has a great chase and things turn out well. If B, turn to page 106, he dies of lung cancer. And it's choose your own adventure, right? Well, says Mordechai to Esther, the book of Purim, life is a choose your own adventure, but actually the headlines are all the end. It's manipulated such that the endings are all going to be pretty much the same, right? Which wasn't the case in Choose Your Own Adventure, by the way. In Choose Your Own Adventure, you could meet your horrible end, right? It wasn't all happy endings in Choose Your Own Adventure. You had to die a few times, go back to the beginning, and find the right combination of choices. And then Mordechai says no, you don't have to do that actually. Whatever you choose, you're going to end up at page 76 because it's been kind of pre-configured that way. And on page 76, the Jews get saved. Of course, there are some ways of telling that story in which Esther gets kind of strung, drawn, and quartered, and you still end up on page 76 and the Jews are saved. And there are other ways of getting to page 76 in which Queen Esther becomes the figure we all know and love, the one who was the actual kind of agent of our salvation. And this is why it's related to theological fatalism. Okay, so the problem of theological fatalism is that because God knows what's going to happen, it's like the script of the future is already written because that's what God knows. Given that God knows the future already, there must be some sort of script for the future, that which he knows about the future. And his knowing the future kind of is what crystallizes or fossilizes the script of the future, vanquishing us of our freedom. That's the theological fatalism. This problem's related, but it's not quite the same. The problem gets going not via thinking about God's knowing everything, but via this way. Jewish theology makes a claim. God has sworn an oath, at least one oath. One of the oaths that God has sworn is that the Jewish people will not be destroyed. Okay? God swears the Jewish people will survive. Now, there's two ways of understanding this oath. One way is just because via his clairvoyance, because he can see into the future and he sees that we don't happen to get destroyed, he can say, oh, by the way, I've looked at I went to page 73 already, I know you're not going to get destroyed, I swear you won't get destroyed. That's one way of reading it, but that's quite passive. It's not that God's guaranteeing to do anything to help us out. It's just, he looks, it happens to be, we survive. Maybe the Italians do too. Well, that's less likely if you look at their kind of history. Belgium, that's a very inoffensive place, right? Belgium survives as well. God looks into the future, he sees that the Belgians survive, and he says, "Oi, you Belgians, I swear you'll survive," right? Okay, so God swears. That's very passive. It's not that God's doing anything. He just sees the future. And you could go to a clairvoyant at the state fair and she'll look into a crystal ball and say, "Oh, I see that I swear that you'll survive." It's not that she's not putting any money down on the table saying, "I'm going to look after you," right? She's just saying, "I see the future. You'll survive." Nothing to do with me, but that's not generally how we understand God's oath, right? What we take it is that God's standing surety for us. God's going to make sure that whatever happens, if push comes to shove and we need divine assistance in order to stay around, God will intervene. That's how we understand God's oath, right? So, unlike theological fatalism, a philosophical problem that's founded upon thinking about God's knowledge, this problem I'm about to develop doesn't think about God's knowledge. It thinks about God's action and agency in the world, God's providence. God has promised that via providential means, we're going to survive. Right? And basically, via some elliptic premises, you'll end up at conclusion C. Haman can't win. Right? Well, that's a problem for Haman. Right? We think we have free will. Right? Now, I'm going to go really philosophical on you. So this is the problem that I really want to focus on. This is the Purim problem. Okay? We think we have free will. We think things are really up to us. But comes Mordechai and he says to Esther, it doesn't matter whether you stand up and act, salvation will come. But imagine all of the Jews in Shushan, maybe all of the Jews in the world. Let's imagine you're all in this room right now. Okay? And Cindy is Esther. Right? And I'm Mordechai. And I say, look, Esther, if you don't stand up and act, we're going to be fine. I don't know about you, but we're going to be fine. Okay? Salvation will come with or without you. But what's your name? Mike. Could I say the same thing to you? Well, presumably yes. Presumably Mordechai would say the same thing to you, right? And what's your name? Maya. I had a great-grandfather called Meyer. Perhaps Mordechai said the same thing to you too, right? Doesn't matter whether you stand up and act, doesn't matter for any given Jew, it doesn't matter whether they stand up and act. Well, what if none of them stand up and act? Surely that would have been a problem, right? Now, then you could say, well, if nobody stood up and acted, then God would have done a miracle because God swore an oath. So sure, that could be it. That could be it. But then we can say, well, the philosophical problems for Haman, right? Haman, let's imagine he's a really clever guy. He figures, we definitely have free will. God isn't the sort of force in the world that intervenes when anything bad happens. We know that, right? Not every time that a nasty murderer pulls a trigger on a gun in front of an innocent victim does God intervene and make the gun jam. Haman knows that. Haman knows that God's given us free will. So Haman takes a punt. Maybe I'll win, maybe I won't win, but I've got free will. Freedom means that, I might succeed, I might not succeed. And Mordechai says no, right? Haman's definitely not going to win. I don't know how he's going to lose. There are many different ways in which he could lose, but he's definitely going to lose. Now I want to examine philosophically this sentence. Haman could have won. Question is that true? Let's take a straw poll. Who thinks it's true that Haman could have won?
Not according to what we were saying.
Well, no, okay, forget Mordechai. Well, you shouldn't forget Mordechai. But putting Mordechai's sage advice to one side, who thinks Haman could have won?
You say it's possible.
Yeah, this is logically possible at least, right? So 1, 2, 3, and who thinks that Haman couldn't have won? Okay, and who hasn't voted?
I thought it was according to God swearing that Christians would always survive.
Sure.
But we're going by that.
Yeah, okay. So given you want to say, okay, so that's useful. Okay, I'm going to use that. Yeah, your observation's useful. Turns out there are many different senses of the word could. Okay, so there's a logical sense. Okay, there's a metaphysical sense. I'm going on to that in a minute. I'll use a posh philosophical word. Nomological sense. And a conditional sense.
This is more like it.
Okay? Okay. So, the logical sense of could is when I say that Haman could have won, I mean that a Hamanic victory wouldn't violate any of the laws of logic. Who thinks that's right? Right? That seems right, right? There's no law of logic violated by a Hamanic victory.
But I'm sorry, Sam.
Yes.
You said earlier that Mordechai believed that the Jews will be saved and God promised to.
Yeah, so we have to. So what we have to try and understand is Mordechai is also using the word could. He says salvation could come by your hand, but it's definitely going to come, right? He's using similar terminology, and the question is how are we supposed to disambiguate words like could? Okay, so I would say that even Mordechai thinks that it's a logical possibility that we'll lose. When he says it's impossible that we'll lose, which is basically what Mordechai says, he doesn't mean it's a logical impossibility. It's a logical impossibility that 2 + 2 should equal 5, according to some. It's a logical impossibility that something can be both true and false at the same time, according to some. It depends what you mean by well, okay, let's just pretend that I didn't say that. So it's probably not what Mordechai means. It's not a logical impossibility. Nomological is when we deal with the laws of science, right? So let's say I already spoke about a causal mechanism. We believe that smoking causes cancer in the human anatomy. That might well be true, but you could imagine a world that operates via different scientific laws, right? In which all humans were able to survive smoking, and we were all immune for one reason or another. One reason why humans could be immune to smoking is because we might have a slightly different anatomy, but that's not what I'm talking about. God could have made the world according to slightly different laws of science, in which tar just doesn't do what it does to lungs, in a world created differently, right? There's no laws of science violated by Haman's winning the Purim story, right? So scientifically, as well as logically, Haman could have won, right? Metaphysical is where we get a little bit, it gets a little bit more dicey. So like metaphysical possibility is when we talk about the definition of words, and given what the word bachelor means, right? This isn't logic. It sounds similar to logic, but it's not logical. It's just based upon definitions of words. Given what the word bachelor means, it's not possible for there to be a world in which all bachelors are married, right? Because bachelor just means unmarried, right? You violated the metaphysical nature of bachelors in a world in which you say they're married, right? And again, unless you think, and maybe Tolstoy, right? There's a quote by Tolstoy about the Jews. He says the Jews are the symbol of eternity. Maybe it's the case, and maybe this is what Mordechai meant, that there's something about the nature of the Jews that makes them eternal, such that a world in which they're destroyed just isn't metaphysically possible. Logically, yes. Scientifically, yes, but not metaphysically, because of what it means to be a Jew. The definition of Jewishness is to be bound up with eternity. Maybe that's what Mordechai meant. I'll leave that on the side. I think we're in much safer ground when we go to conditional senses of possibility. As what's your name again? Me'ira. As Me'ira said, it's given God's oath, given the fact that God has sworn an oath, our survival is assured, right? Haman could have won is false if you define could in a conditional sense. Yeah? Hi.
You'd also have to define one. What did he win?
Okay, so sure. But Haman could have killed every single Jew for all eternity, right? That's not true according to Mordechai, if what you mean by the word could is this conditional sense with knowledge of God's oath in the background.
Did he really have that access?
No, probably not, right? So that's why he thought this was true. Right? We should assume, if we think that Haman was at least minimally rational, and maybe he wasn't, because there are certainly some anti-Semites who are so irrationally driven with hatred that even when things are... I mean, you just have to look at Imash Shlomo, the sorts of resources that Hitler would pour into the destruction of the Jews, even though he was fighting a war on two fronts, to show that hatred isn't always rational. Maybe Haman was just irrational. But assuming for the sake of argument that he was minimally rational, he wouldn't have gone about his evil plan had he known that God had sworn an oath that the Jews are going to survive come what may. So we can assume that Haman thought this was true, potentially, if we're going to assume he's rational, which, like I said, okay, that's a big ask. But Mordechai thinks this is false, on one disambiguation of could. Yes, it's scientifically possible that Haman could win. Yes, it's metaphysically possible that Haman could win. Yes, it's logically possible that Haman could win. But I know, says Mordechai. Sorry, I've already Yotzi, the mitzvah is supposed to get so drunk that you don't know the difference between Mordechai and there. Okay. Says Mordechai, I know that God has sworn an oath to protect us, and given that knowledge in this conditional sense of the word could, I know that Haman can't win. Haman can't win. It doesn't matter, Esther, what you do. Okay, I'm almost ready to finish, basically. What I want to do here is a book by Bertrand Russell. It's called Religion and Science. It's one of his many acribic attacks on religion. And actually, this is like Lahavdil, but if you like owned a Tanakh that was owned by like Lahavdil, Elef Havdalah, like this is a really horrible comparison to make. If you owned a Hebrew Bible that had been owned by Rashi and then Tosfot, this is like this for the atheists. This volume of Religion and Science by Bertrand Russell used to be owned by H.A. Ayer. H.A. Ayer was another massive English rationalist atheist, and I bought it from his estate. So this is it was actually pretty cheap, right? So, this is like an heirloom of atheists, and I'm holding it from them. Okay? But what I did is I copied a couple of pages from it. Could we just pass these around?
What year did he write it?
I'll tell you. He wrote it in 1935. Okay, it's just one sheet, two-sided.
I was wondering if it was recording. It totally is.
Whoa, I'm sorry.
Just one page.
It's just one page on two sides. Okay. I'm gonna read it with you, and it's this was a popular work, but the more popular works I read from the kind of early stages of the 20th century, the more I realise how stupid we've become. Because like if you read popular science today, it's pretty easy. But if you read popular science and psychology from the 1930s, it's pretty hard. Because what people assumed from their reading audience was different. Okay, so what Russell's talking about here in this little excerpt is a tension that exists between classical physics and quantum physics. And put really, really simply, the tension is this. Big things are really predictable. Right? We know exactly the courses that planets are going to move on around the sun and that stars are going to move on around the galaxy and etc. etc. And these laws work so well that we can predict exactly the sort of forces that are at play in putting human beings on the moon. Right? We use classical physics to do that, and it's accurate and it works great. Quantum physics studies really, really little things, right? Subatomic particles. And as far as we're aware, and our knowledge of them has come on a lot since the 30s, but the basic principle's still true, they don't seem to abide by law-like, predictable modes of behaviour. And the question is, it's a simple question, but it's like, well, big things are made out of little things, right? So how can it be that these completely unpredictable little things that you just never know what they're going to do, you get enough of them together and you make a big thing out of them and they'll be completely predictable? And it's kind of a bit weird. It's like it kind of messes with your head trying to put that together. Says Bertrand Russell, according to quantum mechanics, it cannot be known what an atom will do in given circumstances. So an atom is like a really erratic human being. You can just never know what it's going to do next. There are a definite set of alternatives open to it. You see where I am on page 152, the beginning of the second paragraph? You see where I am, everybody? And so follow along with me. And it chooses, I'm going to read because Bertrand Russell had an English accent, so... Although if you've ever heard him, actually, he was an aristocrat, and he sounded a lot like this. It was actually very difficult to continue talking like this. You can't take a breath. You have to have a plumbing on. Okay, we know in what proportion of cases one choice will be made, and in what proportion a second or a third, and so on. But we don't know any law determining the choice of an individual instance. So put simply, given a subatomic particle there's a limited set of things it could do in any given instance. And we know exactly what percentage of the time particles will do one thing, and exactly what percentage of the time particles will do another thing. But this particular particle right now, you've never got a good guess, right? You've never got a clue. You could go by statistics. You could say, the likelihood is, so you flip a coin, right? The likelihood is it's going to be tails is 1 in 2. But you don't know how it's going to, says we are in the same position as a booking office clerk at Paddington train station in London, who can discover, if he chooses, what proportion of travellers from that station go to Birmingham and what proportion to Exeter, and so on, because he can take a survey. He's a clerk in the train station. He just takes a survey. How many of my clients book tickets to Birmingham? How many to Exeter? He can develop a statistical kind of picture of this, but knows nothing of the individual reasons which lead to one choice in one case and another in another. He can never really know when a new client comes, whether it's going to be a Birmingham guy or an Exeter guy. Could be that, 70% of people go to Birmingham because why would you ever want to go to Exeter? But still, I don't know that this could be one of the Exeter people. It's statistically unlikely, but it's possible. I just don't know. I don't know this person. And actually, the cases are not wholly analogous because the booking office clerk has his non-professional moments during which he can find out things about human beings which they do not mention when they're taking tickets. For instance, he can ask them some questions. Why did you go to school? He can listen to their accent, and if they're barely literate, then he knows that they're from Birmingham. So they're kind of things that he can kind of infer from talking to them. But says Bertrand Russell, the physicist has no such advantage because in his unprofessional moments, he has no chance to observe atoms. Basically, you can't have a conversation with an atom and get to know its parents, right? So when he's not in his laboratory, he can only observe what is done by large masses, consisting of many millions of atoms. As we said, large masses are really easy to predict. And it's not even a matter of predicting based on statistical likelihood. We know what causes what. It's not just that I think, if I pour petrol over this car, and do you call gasoline? Sorry. If I am bilingual, but I have to just, okay. If I tweak every now and again, if I pour gasoline over this car and spark a match, it's not, I wonder what's the likelihood that it's going to explode, right? I understand the causal mechanisms here. It's gonna go boom, right? Big things, it's not just they're predictable, we know what causes what. In his laboratory, the atoms are scarcely more communicative than the people who take tickets in a hurry just before the train starts. His knowledge, therefore, is such as the booking office clerks would be if you were always asleep except in working hours. He never finds out anything about his clients. All he can know is they might be going to Birmingham, they might be going to Exeter. I don't know what they're going to do until they do it. Atoms, like people, are unpredictable. Okay, we're going to skip a little bit. Okay, on the next page, page 154, the first full sentence. And then I'll tie everything up and we'll have questions. Believe me, it's going to work somehow. We had, or so we thought, a great mass of evidence from ordinary physics tending to prove that bodies always move in accordance with laws which completely determine what they'll do. Again, it's not about we can predict accurately. We know the case is determined because things are caused to act in the way they're going to act. That's when we're talking about big things. It now appears that all these laws may be merely statistical. Right? It's not true that when I light that match over the gasoline in the car, I know for sure it's going to boom because the match is going to cause it. It's just there's an overwhelming statistical likelihood. And he can explain it in terms of these unpredictable atoms in the following way. The atoms choose among possibilities in certain proportions, and they are so numerous that the result, as regards bodies large enough to be observed by old-fashioned methods, has an appearance of complete regularity. It's going to become clearer with this example. Suppose you were a giant who could not see individual men. Your eyesight's not good enough to see individual human beings. You'll never become aware of an aggregate of less than 1 million of them. If you've got 1 million human beings, they make just enough of a kind of surface area that you can see them. That's how big you are. You can't see individuals. You can see units of 1 million human beings at a time. You would just be able to notice that London contains more matter by day than by night. But you could not possibly be aware of the fact that on a given day Mr. Dixon was ill in bed and did not take his usual train. You would therefore believe the movement of matter into London in the morning and out of it in the evening to be a much more regular affair than it is. Because there's always around 1 million people in London. Right? Now it's about 6 million, right? There's always around 6 million people in London. That number's pretty static. Okay, it grows slowly over time, right? But what you don't realise is that the complexion of that static figure, that 6 million, is really quite fluid. Some days Mr. Dixon turns up to do his shopping and sometimes it's Mr. Smith, right? You would no doubt attribute it, you would therefore believe the movement of matter into London in the morning and out of it in the evening to be a much more regular affair than it is. And because of its regularity, you would no doubt attribute it to some peculiar force in the sun. Or maybe when the sun rises, it kind of causes people to come into London, right? Because you're just looking at big things and it's also regular. When I spark a match over gasoline, it causes an explosion to happen. A hypothesis which would be confirmed by the observation that the movement is retarded in foggy weather. If later you became able to observe individual men, you would find that there is less regularity than you had supposed. One day Mr. Dixon is ill, and another Mr. Simpson. The statistical average is not affected, and to large-scale observation there is no difference. You would find that all the regularity you had previously observed could be accounted for by the statistical law of large numbers, without supposing that Mr. Dixon and Mr. Simpson had any reason, beyond caprice, for their occasional failure to go to London in the morning. Okay, so the basic idea is this. He calls it the statistical law of large numbers. The notion is that really big, large-scale regularities can emerge even out of really fluid and irregular circumstances at a much smaller level. And that seems irrational, but just think about the regular number of people in London. Pretty stable figure, but the actual complexion of that is a very fluid affair. Another example, not from Russell, is the science of the actuary. So the actuary is somebody who works for an insurance firm. And they can predict, to a stunning degree of accuracy, exactly how many people in a given town are going to die of lung cancer that year. They can't tell you who it's going to be, because they're dealing with what Russell's calling here the statistical law of large numbers. And what looks like a mystery isn't so much a mystery. Moving back to the story of Purim and to tie this all up. One way of reading Mordechai's denial of this, Haman could have won, which he denies, at least on some spelling out of what it means, he denies it, is that Haman, the script for him as a human being is already written, and his freedom is radically maligned. He just can't act as he wants to act because God has already set the script. The Jews are going to survive. And just like in the problem I'm not going to solve today of theological fatalism, it looks like somehow God's relationship with the world is making human freedom at least problematic. either because of the problem I'm not going to solve, he already knows everything's going to happen, or in this problem, he's going to keep interfering. Right? Well, how free are we really then, if he's going to keep interfering? There's a really beautiful novel by Dostoevsky called The Brothers Karamazov, and there's a character in that novel, Ivan Karamazov, who feels really kind of bitter against God, because you just can't beat him. Right? According to some theologies, and Jewish theology is close to this, is that in the end we're all going to be saved, every human being, apart from the really, really, really bad ones whose souls get destroyed. We don't believe in eternal damnation. We have this thing called Gehinnom. The Gehinnom is like a temporary type of hell that cleanses your soul. In the end, we're all going to go to heaven. Isn't that great? Well, maybe not, says Ivan Karamazov. What if I don't want to go to heaven? I don't like this God. He always has his bloody way in the end. Right? What if I don't want to be saved? What is going to save me anyway? How am I free? He's always interfering. How does that make me free? Well, the suggestion, I think, that we get from this tone of atheism over here, and actually it's very, very similar to Rabbi Levi ben Gershonides, the Ralbag, and the things that he says about God's providence, is that it's actually possible for God to set a script at the large level, whilst leaving things radically free at the small level. And it seems like there's a contradiction there, right? How can it be that these space rockets act in completely predictable ways, even though we haven't the foggiest clue what any one of the atoms that make up that spaceship's going to do next? How can that be? Well, it can be, it is. There are ways of thinking about it that try to make sense of this. Because somehow patterns only emerge when you've got very large numbers of things, and what Mordechai is able to say to Esther is, look, in a sense, God doesn't play fair because He has set the script, but He's playing fair with you as an individual. It's completely up to you, right? And this, I think, is a major lesson of Purim. It forces us to recognise that even though in hindsight everything's always going to look like it was perfectly done, which is how we started off talking about Purim. Look in hindsight, if any one detail had been different, it would have fallen apart. Everything's always going to look that way, right? When your life's through and done, you're going to look back, please God, and say, now I get it. Right? Oh, now I get, like I said, now I get why God schlepped me to South Bend. But that is consistent. Even though, like I said, looking back, I'm going to see perfect meaning to every single line of the script that was my life, that's consistent with my as a minute individual being radically free all along it. Right? Because these large patterns only emerge when you're looking at a very, very big picture. We know all sorts of things about the Messianic kingdom. It's going to come. There are going to be people who perish in the wars of Gog and Magog, and all sorts of things said. But even if the script is written, the casting list hasn't been filled in, right? You can decide, and this is what Mordechai says to Esther, you can decide to play this role. You could be the Esther Hamalka. If you don't play it, someone else is going to play it, because the script's already written, but the casting's completely free, right? And the same is true to Haman, right? Haman could win, because he could play a different role if he wanted to, right? He couldn't win. The role he chose to adopt was always going to be a losing role, right? If I audition to be Hamlet, I know that my character's going to get it in the neck at the end, right? But I could have auditioned to be a different character, so it's like I can win, just not as Hamlet. Haman, the human being who adopts that role, could win, but he couldn't win as Haman because he can't wipe out the Jews. And that really, for me, is one of the key lessons of Purim that I wanted to share. this notion that however fixed and set things look, and sometimes in our lives things seem we have moments where things seem very random, of course, but there are also moments where our options just look so constricted. We just don't have a choice in the matter, right? And we decide beforehand. We label ourselves in all sorts of ways, superficial things. We label I'm just not a healthy person, right? I haven't exercised since I left high school, right? And I'm not a healthy person, so I don't do that. And my dad keeps saying, well, that's your choice, right? You could start being a healthy person. And sometimes our choices look like they're really constrained. And what Purim says is, however fixed the map of possibilities might look from a big picture point of view, actually your life is completely in your hands. Okay, that's everything. I'll take some questions. Yes?
I have two.
Okay.
The first one is, how does this explain the Pesach story where Hashem hardened Pharaoh's heart? How did he become like the subatomic particle with, radically immeasurable choices or, possibilities in life when it really does appear that somehow he lost the ability to have free will?
Yeah, so that's like a huge other sugya. It's a huge other topic. The autonomy of Pharaoh. How is this fair? You read the story of Pharaoh, his heart keeps being hardened. And of course it's related. But I think there are various moves you could make. I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's some headlines. One move that's often made is that the hardening of Pharaoh's heart was actually to allow him to be free, which was to say that there were so many external pressures on him to let the Jews go, because all of his advisors were saying, look, God's kind of raining down these plagues on me, and there are going to be times in our life, look, it's not going to be the case that humans are radically free. For instance, I simply cannot be 9 feet tall. Right? That's just not one of the choices I have. What it means for me to be free is for me to have a real freedom to choose between some set of choices. Right? The problem with Haman, the problem with Pharaoh was he was in a situation where his freedom was being so radically impinged upon. There were so many external things forcing him to free us. It says one line of commentaries on the story wants to say that God hardened his heart so as to make it the case that when he finally chose to free us, it was really his decision, rather than, okay, maybe that's compatible with the things I was saying. And another broad outline response is that I said about Haman that he could win if he auditioned for a different role in this story, right? But once you've auditioned for a certain role and committed to it, there may be no going back after a certain point. And I think it's often said about Pharaoh is we have here a depiction or a diagnosis of the evil of addiction, which is to say the drug addict may have complete autonomy the first time they choose to try the heroin, right? But once they've dug that grave for themselves, or they've made that bed, they don't have to lie in it. It's to say that the more and more they habituate themselves in this choice they made, the more their freedom becomes curtailed. And that maybe what really happened is that Pharaoh became addicted to his power. He did have a choice to let them go, but as he kept saying no, it became harder and harder each time for him to say no. Yes?
I can buy that. The other one is it too philosophical, if you will, to say that the reason that we really do have free will on whatever level you want to say is because to God there is no yesterday and there is no tomorrow. So what Hashem knew yesterday is...
I said I wasn't going to solve this problem today. But you're giving us medicine, but you're giving us a time-honoured route. One of the most famous routes out of this, in my opinion, erroneously attributed to the Rambam. A lot of people think that the Rambam thinks this way. I think he has a slightly different solution, but definitely a very famous Christian. Am I allowed to say Christian in here? Oh, I said it. Okay. Boethius was a major patristic thinker, and they pseudo-Maimonides, i.e. Maimonides according to the people who think Maimonides said this, and Boethius think the way to solve this problem is to say that 2 isn't true, because 2 places God in time. Right? God doesn't have a past, a present, or a future. So it looks like you've got a puzzle because of the way you've worded it, but there's an inaccuracy there. And actually, so that solution runs. Past, present, and future are all kind of present to God. He's seeing them all, so to speak, simultaneously. But even that is to use a temporal metaphor for God, right? God can't even do 2 things simultaneously, because that's also putting him in time. So the solution is actually a difficult one to state. But using this metaphor, God's looking at the timeline, he's looking at every single scene in history simultaneously. So it's not the case that he knew yesterday what you're going to do tomorrow, because those are the wrong sorts of ways of talking about God. That's one way to try and... It's interesting. Yes?
So you could also, if you looked at history, you've seen Hitler lost, but for a long time he won, and it was terrible. So, we're still here and we went through it and we survived it, but it could have been without Esther doing what she did, we still would have survived, but it could have been
the death toll could have been a lot worse. And I think that's exactly what Mordechai wants to say. And actually, I mentioned Gershonides, and I should just, the Ralbach, my Lady Ben Gershon, I should just say, he has one of the most radical solutions to this on the face of the Jewish man, right? His solution to this is that God doesn't know what you're going to do tomorrow, right? And the reason for saying that is he thinks that the future is not written yet. So God's not knowing it isn't a limitation. It's not like there is something that God doesn't know, because there is no future for him to know. The future hasn't been written yet. And on that approach, I'm not saying what I agree with, I'm just spelling out approaches. On that approach, and this is why Ted's question reminded me of it, on that approach, the idea is that God really, not only does he not know what's going to happen in your lives tomorrow, he might know the statistical likelihoods because he knows you better than you know yourself, doesn't know what you're going to do tomorrow. He doesn't know, for the Ralbag, exactly how things are going to turn out other than these big headlines. It's going to be okay. The Jews are going to survive. If it comes to it, because I made this oath, I'll interfere and make sure it blooming well sorts itself out, right? If it comes to it. But the idea is, the Purim story could have been a whole lot worse. And when I say that, Haman could have won. Do you remember, and I think this is a really nice point, we said, okay, he could have won, he could have wiped out the Jews, logically speaking. He could have won, he could have wiped out the Jews, scientifically speaking. He couldn't have won because God made a promise that he can't win. Okay, and God's promised that if it comes to it, he'll intervene and make sure, right? Or he couldn't win because there are these large sociological patterns that in the end are always going to kind of, and that might be to do with this metaphysical notion of Jews being the symbol of eternity. There are these large-scale kind of socio-political laws that are going to make regularities, and we're going to make sure in the end the Jews win. But he could have come much closer. Right? Things could have been much worse, and that's a radical way of reading the Purim story. Right? One way of reading the Purim story is that, and this is the whole notion of, the word Esther is related to Hester, hidden. God's hidden in this book. He's working behind the scenes, but every single letter and vowel, every single thing, is God manipulating behind the scenes. It was always going to work out this way. Well, on the reading that I've been giving you of 4:14, chapter 4, verse 14, no, could have been much worse. It could have been much worse. And Esther didn't have to be the Saviour. Someone else could have done it. And it could have happened a year later. And it could have been much worse. And that's a possibility that Mordechai at least seems to allow for in what he says to Esther. The question is, we phrase this, who controls our destiny? Well, the answer is God, but the more pressing question is how tightly? You know, and the Holocaust is a great example of this. It's not a great example; it's a horrific example of not particularly tightly. Right? We were saved, and in the long run, the Jewish people have survived and gone from strength to strength. We built a state in the wake of the Holocaust, etc., etc. 6 million human beings were killed. Right? So it's not particularly tightly. In hindsight, we'll see God's hand in every single thing. Like I said, because when you read Hamlet, there's poetry and meaning to every single scene. But the question is, who's going to be cast in what role? And God leaves that very much open. Yeah.
I would wonder, I've always thought about this, is that the Holocaust, the destiny, the things that Hitler did, was predetermined on the day that he was conceived, that he would turn into the homicidal maniac that he became. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I don't. I hope it's not true, but
our destinies are all predetermined.
I understand. What I want to do, because I'm an academic philosopher, I have this tendency to overthink everything, and a real answer to that question deserves like a book, right? And what I've been working on at the University of Notre Dame, who were also involved in bringing me over to South Bend, has actually been this question in the work of the Ishbitzer Rebbe. And the Ishbitzer Rebbe was somebody who was a Polish Hasidic thinker in the 1800s, who thought very much that there's at least a sense in which we have a very strongly determined destiny. There are problems with that though, because if that's true for all of us, then what sense is there in the mitzvot, in the commandments that God gives us? We don't have any choice. You're either going to keep them because you're determined to keep them, or you're not going to keep them because you're determined not to keep them. So there's at least a desire on the part of the believing Jew, the person who believes that God gave us these commandments, to try and make some room in our philosophy for human freedom. Whether it applies to every human being, it's not clear. Whether it applies to us all the time, not clear. Or whether we have to go really sophisticated and think about different senses of the word freedom and different senses of the word destiny. It's a good question.
Because I was always thinking that if someone by chance kicked Hitler's mother in the stomach and caused a miscarriage, the Holocaust would never happen. Or would someone else have been born that could have been another Hitler at another day, at another place?
In the language of the metaphor that I've been developing in this talk, would somebody else have been cast in that role, right? And it's a difficult one. And actually, I want to just accuse myself of it. I'm thinking these things through as I'm talking them, and I want to accuse myself of the slight tension in what I'm saying. On the one hand, I want to say that things are determined at a large level. There's, like we could say, there's going to be a Holocaust, there's going to be a Hitler, there's going to be but undetermined at the personal level, such that, well, it's up to us who plays which roles. There's another sense in which I wanted to say, no, even the script can be changed, right? Because as Mordechai saying to Esther, as my answer to Ted was, could have been much worse. Could be many more people died. So does anybody know, you shouldn't know, from Jewish rabbinical ordination, certainly shouldn't know, of a sitcom called Curb Your Enthusiasm? Anybody know about it? Okay, so the way that Curb Your Enthusiasm is written is quite interesting. What they do is they say, Larry David, the guy who kind of stars in it, but also one of the guys involved in writing it, he writes the kind of arc of each scene. So he says, right, in this scene, we're going to go in the bar, and I'm going to get embarrassed because I'm going to say something silly to somebody, okay? Something like really broad, and they tell all the actors that's what's going to happen, and then they improvise. But they improvise within the contours of the kind of plan of that scene. right? So maybe that would be a better metaphor for the sort of kind of the variety of providence that I'm trying to say God might engage the world in. To say that, lahavdil, God writes the history of the world much like Larry David writes an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is to say, I'll give you some big pointers. The Jews are going to win. There's going to be a Messiah. There's going to be some pretty bad times when the Jews aren't behaving well. There's going to be some pretty good times when the Jews are behaving well, etc., etc. But you fill it out however you please, right? Pretty much like, and within that rubric, there are two kind of freedoms. The first freedom is who's going to play what roles, right? Who's going to be the bumbling schlemazel that Larry David plays in Curb Your Enthusiasm, and who's going to be the kind of pernickety wife that what's-her-face plays in Curb Your Enthusiasm? But also, what are the exact contours of the story going to be, right? Did 6 million people exactly have to die? I hope not. I hope it could have been much less. You know? Yes. I'd like this as a final question.
Well, it's really more of a comment. It makes much more sense with what you were saying to Ted, that the likelihood of having a genocide was very, very high because Esther had so much power. And when she did expose her identity, that caused the major shift, because the big changes in Judaism only happens when there's a massive repentance, which they had the fasting, because Esther said, oh my God, I'm really a Jew, and then Mordechai told everybody we have to fast, and so she did have a major hand in a possible genocide. So when he said that to her, it was, like you said, a sliver of hope because the metaphysical Jews are Jews, they're going to be there. But it makes a lot more sense because she had so much power, this massive empire. I mean, if we try to picture like the empire of Great Britain, this massive, massive empire, and she's the leader with the king, on her side, because he wanted Esther. It was his idea, not hers. So that makes a lot more sense to me.
Well, the question I posed for you, and we can take
and
this
one
over.
more thing I want to say is that I don't think people have that much free will because, like you said, when your options as a heroin addict are diminishing because each time your brain actually needs more of the drug, I think that there are different kinds of people where one person is much more predisposed to be a believer and do the mitzvos and whatever it is, whether they're a leader or a follower or whatever it is, I think that there is actually a very restricted choice to each individual.
No, I'm happy to talk about various levels of predispositions. I think some people are just more predisposed to religion than other people. I accept that. But still, in the end of the day, Pharaoh's heart is hard for him and he still makes the right choice eventually, right? In the end, right? So I think that even though different people have different levels of a challenge and different predispositions, ultimately I'm going to gun for the fact that people are free. Some people just have more of a burden to overcome. Some people's freedom is more challenged. But the question I want to give you in response to your comment and the question to go home with is to think about this. What would have happened had Esther just remained silent? And I think that's just a fascinating question that Mordechai basically poses in one way or another. What's going to happen if you just don't do anything? And what sorts of answers can a frum Jew who believes like Mordechai believes that God has promised to save us, or to make sure what sort of answers are open to us had Esther not have acted? You're right, it looks like everything was gunning for her. She was the only person in that position of remarkable power. There was nothing like. So how else could we have been saved? And I don't know what the answers are. The answers are numerous and some of them are pretty ugly. Maybe the edict would have gone through, Haman's men would have killed all but 2 or 3 Jews, and those 2 or 3 Jews would have had to have escaped to some, like, Siberia outback, somewhere like Siberia, and wait until the Persian Empire falls and rebuilt. I don't know. Right? That's the question Mordechai's asking. What would have happened had it not been for Esther? And really that's the question I think that Jews are supposed to ask themselves, right? What will be if it's not for me?
To me, it sounds like fake ego, because all of those Jews were killed, and there was still that itty bitty. Like you said in Siberia, that's what it sounds like to me.
A remnant.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you.